What's this other jet doing? What's this other jet doing? Holy fuck!
Oh my God! Oh my God! Jesus fucking Christ!
Don't touch it.
Oh my God!
I mean, when you look at it, the building has collapsed. That tower just came down.
This was clearly, the way the structure is collapsing, this was the result of something that was planned. This is not, it's not accidental that the first tower just happened to collapse and then the second tower just happened to collapse in exactly the same way. How they accomplished this, we don't know.
We made it outside, we made it about a block.
We made it at least 2 blocks, and we started running. Floor by floor, instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah, detonated.
They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down. I was watching it and running. Just ran up, and then you just sort of this cloud of shit chasing you down. Just ran up West Street. Without running. I jumped behind a battalion car. You get under the car. It was waiting dark.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty.
World Trade Center Building Number 7. On September 11, 2001, it was one of the casualties of the terrorist attacks on that horrific day. Building 7's sudden and shocking collapse has been overshadowed by the fate of the Twin Towers. But from an engineering standpoint, it is the greater mystery.
We were surprised that Tower 7 collapsed. We being the team that investigated what occurred on that day. There was some damage to Tower 7 caused by the debris that hit it from Tower 1, but the damage was certainly not similar in scope or magnitude to that caused by the aircraft hitting Towers 1 and 2.
The only positive aspect of this building's demise is that it fell 7 hours after the 2 main towers. Everyone had been evacuated, and even though the 47-story building collapsed in on itself in under 10 seconds, no one was killed.
World Trade Center 7 was completed in 1987. It had approximately 1.8 million square feet, 47 stories, and was roughly 600 feet tall. Each of the floors was approximately 40,000 square feet, which is roughly the size of a football field and equal to the size of the floor plate on each of the towers.
The building was a good building. It was soundly designed. It would still be standing if not for 9/11. And it was state-of-the-art at the time, absolutely.
I lost my husband.
My son.
My uncle.
My nephew. September 11th, 2001.
Most people don't know a third tower fell that day.
The government says fire brought it down.
The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fires.
I, along with 1,400 other architects and engineers,
have found the government's conclusion to be physically impossible.
Impossible.
We need the truth about what happened that day.
Go to rememberbuilding7.org.
Why it fell, why it matters, and what you can do.
Do you believe that the government had anything to do with the attack of 9/11? Do you believe in a conspiracy in terms of the attack of 9/11?
No, but I do believe that it is the first time in history that fire has ever melted steel. I do believe that it defies physics for the World Trade Center Tower 7, Building 7, which collapsed in on itself. It is impossible for a building to fall the way it fell without explosives being involved. World Trade Center 7. World Trader 1 and 2 got hit by planes. 7, miraculously, the first time in history, steel was melted by fire. It is physically impossible.
And who do you think is responsible for that?
I have no idea. But to say that we don't know that it imploded and it was an implosion and a demolition is beyond ignorant. Look at the films, get a physics expert here from Yale, from Harvard, pick the school. It defies reason.
Let's get one. Let's get one, because that
I would do it.
Is the unthinkable.
It is the unthinkable. But imagine if somebody could convince you of that, could prove it to you, Elizabeth. Just 7.
Did you know that a third tower fell on 9/11? At approximately 5:20 p.m. on September 11, 2001, World Trade Center Building 7 collapsed in 6.5 seconds from normal office fires, according to the government's final report.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
Later, the government finally admitted that Building 7 collapsed at the rate of free fall after trying to deny it. So what's wrong with a building in free fall? What is free fall?
It's just like taking your car keys out and just dropping them. That's how fast the building came down, for over 100 feet.
This is high school physics.
A building cannot do free fall with 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system without it being blown up.
The only way that a building can accelerate as it collapses is by having pre-engineered, precisely timed, and precisely placed explosives. In other words, controlled demolition.
Saw the big hubbub going on around Building 7. Walked around it. I saw a hole. I didn't see a hole bad enough to knock a building down, though. I saw, yeah, there was definitely fire in the building, but I didn't hear any, maybe this is movie crap. I didn't hear any creaking, or I didn't hear any indication that it was going to come down. And all of a sudden, the radios exploded, and everybody started screaming, "Get away, get away, get away from it!" And I was like a deer in the headlights. And I look up, and I think I remember pretty clearly the 2 guys that I knew were on the transit radio. I don't know if those tapes are out there, but I can try and look for them and show you exactly what I'm talking about. But it was that moment, get away. And I looked up, and it was nothing I would ever imagine seeing in my life. The thing started peeling in on itself, and there was an umbrella of crap 7 feet over my head that I just stared at. And somebody grabbed my shoulder, and I started running, and the shit's hitting the ground behind me. And the whole time you're hearing thum, 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 thum. So I think I know an explosion when I hear it, I was real close to Building 7 when it fell down, and running away from that sucked. That's one of the things that I live with all the time, and I don't know, but that didn't sound like just a building falling down to me while I was running away from it. There's a lot of eyewitness testimony down there hearing explosions. I didn't see any reason for that building to fall down the way it did, and a lot of guys should be saying the same thing.
The Red Cross rep was like, he goes over and he says, well, you got to stay behind this line because they're thinking about bringing the building down. They didn't say what building, they just said bringing a building down.
All I can attest to is that by noon or 1 o'clock, they told us we had to move from that triage site up to Pace University, a little further away, because Building 7 was going to come down or being brought down.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department, and they did use the word, we're going to have to bring it down.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Moving back.
All right, guys. Sorry.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up.
So we're like, okay, we'll take their word for it. We'll stay behind the line. And he went over and he talked to one of the, through all the commotion, he goes over and he asked one of the Red Cross, or one of the firefighters, what was going on. I guess, I don't know if he got an answer or not. He came back over with his hand over the radio, and it sounded like a countdown. And at the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1, and he was just saying, just run for your life, just run for your life. And then it was like another 2, 3 seconds, you heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Just in the last few seconds, another building, building number 7, one of the buildings in support of the World Trade Center towers, has collapsed. This is no small building, as you can see, at 47 stories. It would stand out in most American cities.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and you know, we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was. Well, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and you know, it was horrifying. And then, you know, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground. You know, we were in shock, and then the
high-rise buildings simply do not collapse due to fire. There has never been until 9/11 an experience where a high-rise building that was steel frame completely collapsed. There have been fires burned longer in similar structures without any collapse.
In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, the fires, normal fires, are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In my previous career as a firefighter, normally you'd never be afraid to go into a Type 1 building because they're not combustible, and you would just charge at it and put the fire out. Never in my training were we ever taught that these type of buildings could just collapse in on themselves. There's definitely much more going on than just fire.
The World Trade Center 7 building reminds me of the Meridian Bank building in some ways in Philadelphia. The Meridian Bank building is a 38-story skyscraper that burned for 18 hours in 1991, suffered extensive damage from the fire, but did not collapse.
NIST tells us that this collapse mechanism, starting with thermal expansion, that worked its way upward and outward through the building, in a matter of seconds, there's not enough time for the building to collapse the way that NIST tells us it collapsed.
NIST claims the fires were very large, very hot, and long-lasting, when in reality, observation, which has been researched by many people, shows these fires did not last very long. They were not in the locations where NIST claims they were at given times.
I'm a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. For the 40-plus years that I've been practicing architecture, I have designed a variety of buildings from small houses to high-rise office buildings.
Some of the high-rises that I've worked on are 1 shell and 2 shell here in Houston. I was project manager for a 22-story office building in Akron, Ohio. Later in the day, when World Trade Center 7 collapsed, they had already showed us pictures of a few fires in that building, and I mean, they weren't even raging. And how could that cause a building to collapse as if it were imploded? Couldn't happen.
New York City, 2001. No tall building had ever collapsed primarily due to fire. But that's exactly what investigators believe happened to the 47-story World Trade Center Building 7 on September 11th. According to a 3-year comprehensive building and fire safety investigation just completed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires. We really have a new kind of progressive collapse that we have discovered here, which is a fire-induced progressive collapse. And in fact, we have shown for the first time that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
NIST used detailed data describing the building and its contents to create the most complex computer simulation of a structure collapse ever made. Falling debris from Tower 1 started fires on 10 floors in Building 7. A break in the city water main from the collapse of the towers disabled sprinklers in the lower half of WTC 7, allowing fires on those floors to burn for 7 hours. The NIST computer model was validated with evidence from videos, photos, witness accounts, and other data. It shows that heat from fires expanded long support beams, causing connections and floors to fail.
So you look at the floors failing here, and eventually this column 79 is going to buckle, it fails, and then the entire vertical progression takes place.
If the buildings had come down by fire, we would have seen a more natural progression of collapse.
And clearly a more asymmetrical pattern should have been present.
The symmetry is the smoking gun. It cannot happen that when you have asymmetric damage, you will get a perfectly symmetrical collapse.
The exterior columns on the outside as well as on the inside at the bottom would have to be severed almost at the same time.
The buckled column caused additional collapsed floors and falling debris that removed support from adjacent interior columns. A chain reaction then caused other interior columns to fail in quick succession. The outside shell of the building fell.
I worked for Controlled Demolition Incorporated, CDI, the top-rated explosives demolition firm in the world. As an explosives loader, my job was to place explosives in the buildings to prepare them for demolition. I was licensed while in New York by the New York Fire Department to handle explosives. And I worked on major projects such as Seattle Kingdom, the Three River Stadium, Philadelphia Naval Hospital, and Key Span gas holders in New York. What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it. That's another indicator that this NIST report is very suspect.
When it's all finished, the outside walls are piled one on top of the other right in the middle of the building. Just like a house of cards if it were coming down.
As a structural engineer, I don't believe that the failure of one column would normally bring down an entire building in the way we saw World Trade Center 7 come down.
According to NIST, the failure occurred at column 79 on level 12. This means basically they're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building. That just does not make any sense.
The NIST team found no evidence that explosives were involved in the collapse.
And our analysis showed that even the smallest explosive charge that was capable of bringing down the critical column in the building, had it occurred, we would have seen sound levels of 120 to 130 decibels about a half a mile away. That would have been an incredibly loud sound, and that sound was not picked up by any of the videos or witnesses that we have talked to.
In its final report on the destruction of World Trade Center Building 7, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, went out of its way to avoid investigating the use of explosives. Their sole rationale for not investigating explosive use was the supposed lack of sufficiently loud sounds. NIST computed what they claimed would be the minimum loudness of an explosion that could sever Column 79 with a single blast. Then they claimed no observers detected explosions as loud as their predictions.
This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
On the basis of this artificial threshold of interest, they swept aside all evidence of actual explosions and concluded that no explosives contributed to the destruction of the building.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7.
Yet there was voluminous evidence of explosions.
Here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
You heard explosions, like boom.
We just heard one more explosion. That's about the fourth one we've heard.
A few blocks up West Broadway, looking toward the World Trade Center in the distance, Ashley Banfield was conducting an interview for MSNBC.
You were just told by police that you should move out of your...
The mic was set to pick up speech a few inches away. From the involuntary startle response,
oh my God,
we know explosions are being heard. However, listening closely, we discover that the microphone did indeed pick up the sounds of explosions, but very faintly. Turn up the volume. Listen for a low rumble in the background.
you were just told by police that you should move out of your apartment, Fabiana. Yes. You've got Carolina here?
Yes. They advised us to leave because we have...
Oh my God.
This time, the sound has been filtered to emphasize low frequencies. Listen for booms like a bass drum in the distance.
In fact, you were just told by police that you should move out of your apartment, Fabiana. You've got Carolina here? Yes. They advised us to leave because we have... Oh my God.
Here's a different version, filtered to emphasize the mid-range sounds. The bass drum is gone. I would describe the blast sound like a train on a bumpy track.
You were just told by police that you should move out of your apartment, Fabiana. Yes. You've got Carolina here?
Yes. They advised us to leave because we have...
Oh my God.
Here's the original sound again.
You were just told by police that you should move out of your apartment, Fabiana. Yes. You've got Carolina here?
Yes. They advised us to leave because we have...
Oh my God. Look behind us. Please pan in this way. Please be careful of your baby. This is it.
That's the building coming down.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. No. No.
If you didn't hear the blasts, back up, use earphones, turn up the volume, and listen again. There were 2 blasts, followed by 7 more, regularly spaced, all in 2.5 seconds. Craig Bartmer's testimony may come to mind.
The whole time you hear boom, 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 boom. I think I know an explosion when I hear it.
When we hear the sharp, regular series of sounds in the background, the building has not yet started to fall. When we hear the reporters say, "This is it,"
this is it,
the building has not yet started to fall. The fall of the building corresponds to the crescendo in the crowd response. Here is another street scene with the building in full view. The crowd responds almost immediately as the building starts to fall. This occurs just after the reporter says, "This is it."
This is it. Oh my God. Oh my God.
Therefore, the blasts we heard occurred seconds before the building started to fall. When Ashley Banfield says, "This is it," it is because she has been previously told to expect Building 7 to come down.
The brown building, the tall one, is number 7 World Trade Center. I've heard several reports from several different officers now that that is the building that is going to go down next.
Back in the studio, the anchor, Brian Williams, not only had foreknowledge of the collapse, he had a ready explanation.
What we've been fearing all afternoon has apparently happened. We were watching number 7 World Trade, which was part of the ancillary damage of the explosion and collapse of the other 2.
Just as Ashley Banfield was told, Brian Williams was told. There is indeed evidence that even the top fire officials were told.
We are on the phone with New York Fire Department Lieutenant David Restuccio. Lieutenant, where are you right now?
I'm at the corner of Northmore Street and Greenwich Street.
Can you confirm it was number 7 that just went in?
Yes, sir.
And you guys knew this was coming all day?
We had heard reports that the building was unstable and that it eventually would either come down on its own or it would be taken down.
Those in control of the story were planting the official narrative in our psyches in real time as events unfolded, using the press and even the fire and police departments as their unwitting agents.
We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex, is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing. And clearly those fires continue to burn at about 4:15 Eastern Daylight Time.
Building number 7 was going to collapse. That appears to be what has happened now.
One of those smaller buildings just fall to the ground. We had heard earlier that it was structurally unsafe.
We're getting word from New York right now that another building has collapsed. I understand that this is a 47-story building.
Information, of course, take a look at that right-hand side of the screen.
It's going down right now.
There it is.
Yep.
It went down right there. This is not from an explosion or an aircraft at this point. From our knowledge, the information that we have is that this is a building that probably was incredibly structurally damaged.
NIST is being dishonest.
That would have been an incredibly loud sound, and that sound was not picked up by any of the videos or witnesses that we have talked to.
NIST was lying about no testimony of explosions. There was both testimony and recorded evidence of explosions. However, NIST discounted any evidence of explosions that did not exceed its artificially contrived threshold of interest. The minimum sound level of interest, as determined by NIST, was based on a blast of RDX, one of the loudest explosives available, large enough to break a major column outright with a single blast. They assumed no efforts at noise abatement, complete transmission of the sound to the outside air, no absorption or blockage of the sound along the path. And who knows if they assumed the use of an efficient cutter charge, or if they simply figured the effect of a bomb planted beside a column. They don't say. Their sole reason for doing this calculation was to create a pretext to sidestep any actual investigation of explosives. Why would NIST, or anyone else, choose to exclude from its investigation any evidence of any explosions related to the destruction of the building?
At the same time, it should be noted that NIST's report on Building 7 was never published by a peer-reviewed publication. This means their analysis of the collapse cannot be validated from a scientific point of view. Even though this was an unprecedented event in history, we are being asked by NIST to take their word for the soundness of their conclusions.
It's based on sound science, and it is consistent with all the observations we have.
But it has never happened before, right?
But the physics is consistent, it's sound, it's been analyzed, and we have the results. And we are very comfortable with our findings.
They might have been comfortable, but the scientific community of architects and engineers was not.
Science is never secret when it's done right. Science isn't science unless it's published, unless it's openly published and made available for criticism.
Architects and Engineers has asked NIST to at least verify the computer model on which they've based their theory of the collapse. But also in this case, NIST has refused to make their data public.
Structural engineers rail against NIST because they refuse to show the visualization. It's a black box. You cannot download any of this data.
This means that also for the accuracy of their computer model, we have to take NIST's word for it.
Here is our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
This is the video of the event. On the right is one of the two animations released by NIST on the collapse of Building 7.
When you observe the footage of how the building failed, and when you look at the animation of the failure, and compare that to what you actually observe in reality, I think they disprove their own theories. It is impossible for it to fail the way they said.
The second animation released by NIST is even more inconsistent with the real event. While the animation shows a pronounced inward bending of the top of the structure, the video footage shows the entire top section of the building maintaining its shape all the way through the visible part of the collapse. This can be verified by different angles. If this is what NIST calls matching quite well, one can imagine what the reliability of their entire report can be. In order to justify the first and only collapse in the history of a steel skyscraper due to fire, the debunkers have maintained that Building 7 was weaker than the average steel structure because it had been built over an existing electrical substation.
The building was extremely unconventional. It had this giant Con Ed substation with enormous trusses carrying extraordinarily high loads, very vulnerable to fire and other kinds of damage.
But NIST itself has refuted this possibility. From the final report we read, the transfer elements such as trusses, girders, and cantilever overhangs that were used to support the office building over the Con Edison substation did not play a significant role in the collapse of World Trade Center 7. In fact, it was the opposite. After it was completed, Larry Silverstein had the building reinforced beyond its requirements in order to accommodate the needs of its main tenant, Salomon Brothers. From this 1989 New York Times article we read, Salomon Brothers intends to spend nearly 2 years and more than $200 million cutting out floors, adding elevators, reinforcing steel girders, upgrading power supplies, and making other improvements in its million square feet of space. We built in enough redundancy to allow entire portions of floors to be removed without affecting the building's structural integrity, said Larry Silverstein, president of the company. More than 375 tons of steel, requiring 12 miles of welding, will be installed to reinforce floors for Salomon's extra equipment. If there was one skyscraper in the world that should have never collapsed due to fire, it was Building 7.
In other news this week, the finding that allowed the National Institute of Standards and Technology to withhold data from its World Trade Center 7 collapse simulation has finally been released via whistleblowing site Cryptome.org. The finding was made on July 9, 2009, and reads in part, quote, "The disclosure of the information in connection with NIST's investigation of the technical causes of the collapse of the World Trade Center towers and World Trade Center Building 7 on September 11, 2001 might jeopardize public safety. Therefore, NIST shall not release the information." End quote. Although the finding was made last year, the actual finding itself was not available to those who had requested the information, leading many to suspect that it would contain details of exactly how or why the data from NIST's WTC-7 collapse simulation would jeopardize public safety, but no such explanation is to be found. Analysts note the finding is especially odd given that NIST itself has claimed that the collapse of WTC-7 was an extraordinary event, unprecedented in history, and that they arrived at that conclusion using the computer model whose input and result data they have now classified in the name of public safety.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires, similar to those we have seen in other tall buildings, caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fires. This is the first time that we're aware of that a building over 15 stories tall has collapsed primarily due to fire. We reached this conclusion by reconstructing the entire building, beam by beam, column by column, connection by connection, into a computer model, a virtual WTC-7 building.
Many are wondering whether NIST's reluctance to release their data is due to the questionable nature of the science underlying a simulation that many have pointed out is little more than a visual recreation of the initiation of a building collapse, which in itself explains nothing and does not even show the entire progressive collapse of the 47-story building.
Zie je vanaf boven gaan? Nee, je gaat vanaf onder.
Die gaat vanaf onder, ja.
Toch?
Ja.
Ze hebben gewoon kolommen weggeblazen. Er is nagesprongen.
Dit valt anders dan het World Trade Center.
Vind je niet dan?
Ja, je ziet het, de onderste verdiepingen gaan eerst.
Ja, en de rest zakt er gewoon in. Dus dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten?
Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Maar dit is ook op 11 september gebeurd.
Dezelfde dag?
Dezelfde dag.
Dezelfde dag? Weet je dat zeker?
Ja.
Was het zeker weten de 11e? Dat kan geen waar zijn.
7 uur nadat de World Trade Center naar beneden viel.
Ja? Hebben ze hard gewerkt.
In het officiële onderzoeksrapport van FEMA staat dat ze niet kunnen verklaren waarom gebouw nummer 7 is ingestort. Uitgebreid bespreken we alle mogelijke oorzaken met Danny Jowenko.
Dat weet ik niet precies, maar ze hebben wel...
Maar hij blijft erbij dat het gebouw is opgeblazen.
Het is vakwerk, zonder meer. We weten heel goed wat ze doen, die jongens.
De vraag is dan, is zoiets van tevoren voorbereid of kan dat op 11 september zelf nog zijn besloten en uitgevoerd?
Met hoeveel man heeft u hoeveel tijd nodig om dat te doen?
Dat weet ik niet precies, maar...
Maakt u een inschatting?
Ja, dan moet je wel ervaren mensen hebben, maar als je een man of 30, 40 zou hebben... Kijk, een paar met de snijbrander, de rest brengt hem aan. Andere mensen sluiten dat deadcord met die boosters aan. Dat moet allemaal precies op hetzelfde moment gaan. En weer een derde die zet de elektronische systemen erop. En dan gaat hij.
Terwijl overal brand was en ook in dat gebouw was brand?
Dat is niet geblust.
Ze hebben de brand niet geblust. Dus de mensen die dat moesten doen, die moesten het doen terwijl het binnen nog brandde.
Ja, dat is vreemd. Dat is vreemd. Dat vind ik ook heel vreemd. Daar heb ik geen verklaring voor.
Hi, my name is Barry Jennings. I'm 52 years old. I've worked for 33 years at one location. When the Office of Emergency Management did an activation, they always included our locale. And what they did was monitor the emergency. They actually coordinated the emergency through several agencies. I received the call shortly after the first plane hit. I got there, I had to be inside on the 23rd floor when the second plane hit. Upon arriving into the OEM EOC, we noticed that everybody was gone. I saw coffee that was on the desk. Still, the smoke was still coming off the coffee. I saw half-eaten sandwiches. And only me, Mr. Hess, was up there. After I called several individuals, one individual told me that to leave and leave right away. Mr. Hess came running back in and said, we're the only ones up here, we got to get out of here. He found the stairwell. So we subsequently went to the stairwell and we're going down the stairs. When we reached the 6th floor, the landing that we were standing on gave way. There was an explosion and the landing gave way. And I was left there hanging. I had to climb back up and now I had to walk back up to the 8th floor. When I made it to the 6th floor and there was an explosion, the explosion was beneath me. Keep in mind now, it's pitch black in there. All the lights went out. So when the explosion happened, it blew us back. I'm thinking I'm standing on the landing. I'm actually holding on to a pole above us. And I had to climb back up because Hess is yelling, what do we do now? I said, there's only one thing we can do and it's go back up. Both buildings were still standing. Both buildings were still standing. Both buildings were still standing. Keep in mind, I told you the fire department came and ran. They came twice. Why? Because building tower 1 fell, then tower 2 fell. And then when they came back with all concern now, like to get me the hell out of there. I was trapped in there for several hours. I was trapped in there when both buildings came down. All this time, I'm hearing all types of explosions. All this time, I'm hearing explosions. When they finally got to us, and they took us down to what they called the lobby, because I asked them, I said, when we got down there, I said, where are we? He said, this was the lobby. And I said, you gotta be kidding me. It was total ruins. Total ruins. Now keep in mind, when I came in there, the lobby had nice escalators. It was a huge lobby. And for me to see what I saw, it was unbelievable. And the firefighter that took us down kept saying, do not look down. And I kept saying why. He said, do not look down. And we were stepping over people. And you know you can feel when you're stepping over people. This big giant police officer came to me. And he says, you have to run. I said, I can't run, my knees are swollen. He said, you're gonna have to get on your knees and crawl in. He said, because we have reports of more explosions. And that's when I started crawling. And I saw this guy fall behind me and his comrades came to his aid. They dragged him to safety. I'm just confused about one thing and one thing only. Why World Trade Center 7 went down in the first place. I'm very confused about that. I know what I heard. I heard explosions. The Explanation I got was it was the fuel oil tank. I'm an old boiler guy. If it was a fuel oil tank, it would have been one side of the building. Yes, you can use this footage.
Normally, when you have a structural failure, you carefully go through the debris field, looking at each item, photographing every beam as it collapsed and every column where it is in the ground, and you pick them up very carefully and you look at each element. We were unable to do that in the case of Tower 7.
Live and at large, it's the one 9/11 mystery that endures. World Trade Center building number 7.
You hear that? Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down soon.
I do believe that it defies physics for the World Trade Center Tower 7, Building 7, which collapsed in on itself. It is impossible for a building to fall the way it fell without explosives being involved.
And if explosives were involved, that would mean that the most obnoxious protesters in recent years are right. If you hear the shouting, it's a group of demonstrators who've come. 9/11 was an inside job. Oh, get a life. Get a life. 9/11 was an inside job.
Welcome to the show, everybody. I'm Geraldo Rivera, and that noisy demonstration was more than 2 years ago. But the folks behind that TV ad you saw earlier are not so easy to dismiss as those demonstrators were. And what caught my eye is their claim that more than 1,300 architects and engineers examined the evidence about Building 7's collapse and disagree with the official report issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. But up front tonight, Building 7 was no ordinary building. Among other key tenants, including several intelligence and law enforcement agencies, it also housed New York City's Emergency Operations Center, known as Mayor Giuliani's bunker. Here to tell us what they know about its collapse and why they question the official conclusions are Bob McIlvaine, whose son died in the World Trade Center, and Tony Zambati, a mechanical engineer. Nice to see you guys. Welcome.
Thank you,
welcome.
Geraldo.
Nice to meet you, Geraldo. Our condolences, obviously, for your loss. But Tony, let me start with you. You're an engineer. Are you suggesting that the official account that Building 7 collapsed because of the fire melting the steel or in some other ways, destroying the integrity, the structural integrity of the building, that's false? You think that that's false?
Yes, I do. And for a couple reasons. One is that Building 7 came down. It went into a sudden collapse across the full width and length of the building for 2.25 seconds, which amounted to 105 feet, or 8 stories, 8 13-foot tall stories. It was in full free-fall acceleration. That is impossible because in a natural collapse, columns would have to buckle. When columns buckle, there is a minimum resistance. It's asymptotic, if you know what that means. That means it never goes to zero. So it's impossible. You can't reach.
So here's what, I guess in layman's terms, to just get my hands here, Peter. So what he's saying is that the top floor collapses, hits the next floor, hits the next floor, hits the next floor. So it's bang, 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 bang. The weight of the upper floors.
It would slow down. What I'm trying to say is it was in full free fall acceleration. All of its potential energy was being converted to motion.
Instead of what I just described, the thing just collapsed like a pancake.
It just came down.
And so what are you suggesting brought it down, Tony?
I'm suggesting there was some form of demolition devices in that building for 8 stories or more.
You think that the explosives brought down Building 7?
Some form of demolition device. I'm not pretending to know what it is. I am saying that it was in free fall acceleration.
All right, let me ask you this.
Admitted to that.
Okay, let me ask you this before I get to Dad, before I get to Bob here. We've all seen old, obsolete buildings and public housing in other places outlive their usefulness, being demolished by the professionals who can actually collapse a building right in its own footprint. That's what it looks like happened to Building 7. Do you believe that's what happened?
Yes, I do believe that's what happened.
And why do you think they're lying about it?
I don't really know all the details of what they're lying about. I can't read their minds. All I can say is, scientifically, it's impossible for fire to have done what we see.
And Bob, these 1,300 engineers and architects who agree with you and some of the other relatives' families. I know you found your son just a couple of days after the disaster. He was outside. I don't want to get into the details of how you believe he died, but these architects and engineers, do they support your contention? Do you believe that it was an inside job, that 9/11 was an inside job?
All right, Geraldo, I believe it was an inside job, okay? I'm here
You believe our government?
All right, wait, look, please. But the thing is, we don't have enough time to get into the reasons of that. We set up this Building What campaign. We saw the...
Building What?
.org.
BuildingWhat.org.
The reason we have that is because Judge Lehner, when we had a petition to have a new investigation in New York City about Building 7. And when the lawyers...
And you're asking the New York City Council. I don't want to interrupt also to reopen.
So I know we don't have the time, but anyway, he said, building what? Because no one has any idea about Building 7. So because I believe in... I've talked to so many firemen, so many EMS workers, policemen, who talk about the explosions. And I know you don't want to get into my son's... But I feel my son died from an explosion. I went to all the 9/11 Commission hearings. I've been researching this for 9 years.
So what do you want? Let's get to the bottom line before we're out of time.
I want truth. I've been lied to. I mean, it's beyond a reasonable doubt that the 9/11 Commission did not tell this story.
9/11 Commission barely mentioned Building 7, if at all.
Right.
Okay, what forum do you want the investigation in?
Well, the forum, what we want it is in New York City right now, because New York City, we feel, has an obligation to investigate 9/11.
So before we're out of time completely, Bob, do you want specifically the New York City Council to open its own investigation of the Building 7 collapse?
Absolutely.
And that would satisfy you if they did that?
Well, I'm not done. I'm still a parent. I'm a parent who has an obligation to find out why my son was murdered. As far as this show and New York City, I want the investigation. That will not be sufficient enough.
Your wound. I get it.
And I'm going beyond that.
But it's the beginning.
Of course it's the beginning, but that's why I support this Building What campaign.
Bob McElvain, we thank you. Tony Zambati, thank you very much. It is an intriguing topic. I certainly am much more open-minded about it than I was, and it is because of the involvement of the 9/11 families and all these engineers and architects. Clearly, they know more than I do. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you.
I became a firefighter in 1990, March of 90. My whole family was firefighters. Goes back a long day. I'm looking up. All of a sudden, we hear, what the hell? Is in seconds, you see the wing of the plane come in, crash through the building, and explode bodies out of the building, all on Liberty Street. I run in screaming, a plane just hit the Trade Center. A plane just hit the Trade Center. I get on the phone to the dispatcher saying a plane, 1060 the box, plane just hit the Trade Center. Get all emergency vehicles down here immediately. It's on. So as we are now saddling up, trying to get out of quarters, and hundreds and hundreds of people are trying to run in, my bodies are now just exploding on the ground. Like, what is going on here? The street was on fire. We were so dumbfounded because by the time we got around to the corner, to the west side, there was 30 floors of fire. We were like, holy cow, something's up here. And we got into the lobby, went to the command post right next to Father Judge, Chief Gansey, Chief of Department at the time, God rest his soul, and Father Judge. We got there, we got our orders from the command post to team up with Engine 5 and start our way up, right? So we're standing there in the lobby, we're getting all together. All of a sudden, we hear... I look down to my right, and the elevators exploded, something out of like a Bruce Willis Die Hard movie. People just come running out of the elevators, on fire, fireball. I mean, it was like, what is going on here? Something's up here. I mean, the plane's up there, now there's fire down here. People run around all on fire. This is crazy. So we said, look, we had our orders. That's our job. We're going to do what we got to do. So we were going up the stairs. As we were going up, there was fire here, there was fire. People burnt up on different levels, and we were trying to get a read on what floor are you coming from? What floor are you coming from? Is there fire on your floor? Is there fire on your floor? We were asking, and they were like, there's some fire on our floor. There's people trapped on other floors, and we're like trying to get a read. These people were pretty calm. People burnt coming down, just saying thank you, fireman. We were going up. We were heading up to the 24th floor of the stairwell, and all of a sudden we heard, Mayday, Mayday, second plane, second plane. Swift, we're looking at each other like, come on, second plane, there's no way there's a second plane. Within seconds, our building got rocked. We got bounced around in the stairwell like pinballs, man. And we just said, you know what? Time to go. We got out as much people as we could. Most of the people were out. We were the last guys going up the stairs. We got down. We started taking off. About 12 of us. We got down to the 3rd floor, and that's where the stairwell collapsed on us. And we had to dig our way out. Now the building's coming down. We can't see nothing. Once again, saying our prayers. The show is over here now. This is it. And with that, all of a sudden, we're looking for another stairwell. Me and the lieutenant open the door. We find a body in this closet. We were like, what the heck is that? Where did this come from? Holy shit, what's going on here? Something's crazy going on. We got our way out of the 3rd floor, and that's where the maintenance fella, with a little flashlight, saved our lives. He was pointed over, and if it wasn't for him, we never would have found another stairwell. The building would have collapsed. So
Willie Rodriguez?
Willie Rodriguez. Thank you, Willie. He saved our lives. He saved about 12 guys' lives that day. At least. We got down to the lobby, and everything was blown out, exploded. Everything was. And we were the only ones in the lobby now. We're going, wait a second here. Where is everybody? Because the building was coming down the outside. They moved the command post to World Trade Center too. So now we're like, we didn't get no. Where is everybody? We were in the lobby. Oh, it looks like everything was exploded. Everything was gone. We're like, what is going on here? We didn't know. We were like, this is crazy. All of a sudden, we said, listen, man, no time to cry for your mommy. We got to get out of here. So we took off like cockroaches. 12 of us. We all went our own ways. I ran across North End Avenue and outran the building, throwing my gear off, strip it down to my skivvies. I was standing on the ledge, watching the building come down. I was diving in the river to Jersey. I said, this is it, man. This is the end of the game here. I mean, I made it this far. I'm not going to let them get me now. No way. And what happened was, after that, we ran down North End Avenue, and there came the other tower. We were like, something's very wrong here. And as we ran, we ran down. We came around to Duane Street, where the filming of the French guys were that morning. And we had to go check in with the chief on Duane Street to count how many guys we thought might have died, and guys in my company who we were with. So we kind of figured we lost 3 right at that time. We actually ended up losing 5.
And what was your feeling about the lobby being so destroyed, as you said?
I mean, we were saying, how is this happening when it was 80 stories up? And, like, we was just, you think about it, you say, something else had to go on here. Something else was going on here. This just don't happen like this when a plane hits the 80th floor of a building and the lobby gets blown out. Sorry. I don't care who you are.
What happened?
We was in an explosion. We was in the lobby and the 3rd explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
What was it like?
Horrible.
It's like hell. You don't want to know.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the planet, probably?
Yeah, definitely a secondary explosion. Because we was inside waiting to go upstairs, and on the way upstairs, the whole fucking plane blew. And we just collapsed on everybody inside the lobby.
Similar to the first tower coming down, secondary?
I don't know about the first one, but I know the second was terrible. Then there was a 3rd one too after that one.
3rd explosion after that?
That's right. Everybody was inside the building, waiting to go upstairs. And they just let loose. Everything just let loose inside the building.
So what you told me is that there was a plane or whatever hit the building, then a secondary explosion.
It was like 3 explosions after that. We came in after the fire. We came when the fire was going on already. We was in the staging area inside the building, waiting to go upstairs. And they exploded. The whole lobby collapsed on the lobby inside.
And it's just mayhem after that?
Just everybody tried to make their way out.
Just trying to help all the brothers get out.
A lot of people trapped inside and everything.
People don't understand. There may be more. Any one of these fucking buildings could blow up. This ain't done yet.
For every window in the lobby to be exploded, I mean, them windows were like as thick as forget it. They were 2-3 inch glasses, come on. They exploded out of the lobby, something, it wasn't from the jet fuel. No way. The elevators exploded. They were down from the lobby. The lobby was over here. That should never have happened. Something would happen there, and that wasn't. We came down. It looked like a bomb went off in the lobby. There was no fire. It just looked like a bomb went off, and the building collapsed. the time and the things that went on between the plane and by the time the buildings came down, there was a lot of things that happened that makes you really wonder what went on here. And that's you know, it's too much. It's too much. There's too many things that went wrong that I mean, I don't like, you know, I'm not, I guess, an expert on a plane hitting a building, but just me being in there and experiencing what I've seen and dealt with, something wasn't right that day. And I think everybody in that lobby knew it.
It's safe to say that you agree with the premise that the Twin Towers, and especially Building 7, were brought down with other means than just a plane hit.
I believe so, yes. Yes. I personally, yes.
You've become quite associated, haven't you, with the extraordinary events that day, because you were...
That is correct.
You're supposed to be the last man who left the North
Tower when it collapsed.
What were you actually doing in there to start with?
Well, I worked in the building for 20 years, and I was a janitor. I was a person that actually cleaned 110 flights of stairwells every day. And on 9/11, I had the only master key that was available.
Which you have with you here. This is the master key that was used.
They call it the key of hope.
I started the day by calling my supervisor and telling him that I was not going to work. The reason was that it was such a beautiful day that I wanted to stay home. I wanted to take a sick day off. And I called my supervisor and he begged to me to go back into the company. And I made it to work, but I made it late. And that was a miracle by itself, because if I made it there at 8 o'clock, I would have been dead automatically, or I would have been trapped on the top of the building.
And at 8:46, we hear, boom! An explosion so loud that pushes upwards in the air. The walls cracked, the false ceiling fell on top of us, the sprinkler system got activated, everybody started screaming in horror, in pure horror, because we didn't know what it was. And the first thing that comes to my mind is that a generator just blew out on the basement, on the mechanical room.
I was on B1, basement 1, when this huge explosion happened that pushed us upwards in the air, an indication that something very powerful exploded below us. And at that moment, when I went to say it, we hear, pa! The impact and the explosion of the plane on the top. Two different events separated by 7 seconds, more or less.
Two separate explosions were recorded at a distance of about 9 seconds from each other during a business meeting that was taking place in a building nearby, One Liberty Plaza.
It sounds like something crashed.
And you could hear the difference from the top and from the bottom. Come on, I work in the building for 20 years and I know the difference between something coming from the basement and something coming from the top. So everybody's screaming in horror, help, help, and we didn't know what to do.
What floor were you actually on when the first plane hit?
I was in the basement. I was in the basement, actually. There was
Right.
a huge explosion in the basement, and at that moment, the first thing that I said, whoa, it's a generator that just blew up. And because we have no windows, we have no way of saying, you know, what's going on. A person comes running into the office saying, explosion, explosion. All the skin hanging from under his armpits, on both arms to the top of the fingertips. And when I look at his face, pieces missing from his face. And I said, what happened? What happened?
I was in the B4 level, and on my way, I heard a bomb. So I says, probably the transformer again blew up. So I stepped back, finished what I had to finish, and I started towards the door again. And there come a big blast with a big ball of fire.
And when I said, don't move, because I was going to pick up the phone to call the emergency medical unit that was located on the other tower, bang, another explosion. And that's when I said, no, everybody's got to get out.
From the initial explosion in the basement, I took 14 people from the basement, led the way out so they could go outside the building because nobody was taking the leadership. After that I went back, went into the North Tower. There were two people stuck inside of an elevator, a lift, and they have water going into the lift, and they were encapsulated, and they were screaming that they were going to drown. I was able, with the help of another guy, to open the door, find a ladder, get these two people out, save them, take them outside the building, and go back inside the building. There were 5 master keys in the building, and I have the only one available at that moment.
And this key was basically what I used to actually go with the firemen, floor by floor. We start making it up the staircase, and as we go up, we hear small explosions going off. Pa! Pa! Different areas.
So you climbed up the stairwells with the firefighters, trying to open the doors, trying to let as many people as possible escape.
Now, again, why is this key so important? Because Class A building, the codification in New York is that any skyscraper, 3 doors will not open on the staircases, 1 will open. 3 won't open, 1 will open. So we have to go and open all those doors that did not open. When we got to the 27th floor, the whole unit of firemen collapsed on the corridor, one after the other, because they couldn't continue going up. It was physically impossible for them to continue. They took their equipment, they took their jackets, they took their boots, they dropped themselves on the floor. A very shocking moment for me, because I said, oh my God, I feel like I have to go alone now. Remember, David Lim said, Willie, do you know this floor? I said, yeah, I know this floor. He said, where can I get water? He said, on the other side, there's a machine. So let's go. He breaks the machine. We start taking bottled water, putting it on trash cans, and bringing it to the firemen and giving them the bottled water. I remember I called my mother from a phone that was working in that office. Call her. My mother is in Puerto Rico. But I wanted to let her know that there was an accident in case she heard something on the news, that I was okay. When she picked up the phone, she was like, what are you doing there? Everybody in the world knew but us what was happening. She said, get out now. And I said, I can't. I'm helping these people. They don't know the building. But don't worry. And I lied to her. I said, I'm going to get up to a certain part, but I'm not going to get to the area where they have the fire. When my actual intention was to go to Windows of the World and help my friends. That was my motivating and the power that was actually pushing me to go to the top. Because I knew these people were stuck in there. I hung up on the phone and I have calls from my supervisor say, Rodriguez, abandon the building right now. Abandon the building right now. And I say, I can't. I'm helping the fire department. He said, that's not your job. Get out now. I turn off the radio and I continue going up by myself, opening door, letting people out, and I continue going up until I got to the 39th floor. When I got to the 39th floor, from the opposite staircase, there were 3 staircases, A, B, and C. Police officer David Lim came up with 2 firemen. And as we were talking about what was going to be our next move, we hear, boom! The impact on the other tower. And it was so hard that our building oscillated so much that we lost practically our footing. And all of a sudden we hear, boom, 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 boom. And on the radio, we lost 65. We lost 65. Meaning that the 65th floor collapsed floor by floor by floor by floor. Up to the 44th floor, the sky lobby, 5 flights away. And I started screaming, we gotta go up, we gotta go up. Officer Lim said, Rodriguez, you've done enough, but you don't get paid for this. And I said, what? I'm going up. And he said, no, you stay here, you're still a civilian, and you are my responsibility. And I said, sorry, I'm not giving the key to anybody, I'm going up. And he said, better if you give me a hand with the person on the wheelchair on the 27th floor. And he said, you know, David, I'm going to go down, but I'm coming right up. I'm going to help you with that, but I'm coming right up. So I ran down to the 27th floor. When I ran to the 27th floor, I screamed to the firemen, I have orders to get this guy out right now. The guy was taken out of the wheelchair. He was put on a rescue basket, all tied up. 3 guys stood up and said, let's go. We grabbed him. We started going down the stairwell. As we go down, we make it to the lobby. We make it to the lobby. And all of a sudden, one of the firemen tells me, please, go get the ambulance ready. And I hear, run, run, run. I look at the left side and I see the Marriott Hotel almost gone. Bodies everywhere. And I said, God, please help me. And the only thing I see is a fire truck in front of the building. And I just slid right under the fire truck. And all of a sudden the building started to destroy itself on top. And you hear, boom, boom, boom. And the truck going down. And all I said at that moment was, please don't let my mother see my body in pieces. Let her recognize my body, please, please.
The building basically engulfed me, and I was totally buried under the rubble, alive. And then this dust came. That dust went under every orifice under the truck, and it basically burned my face, burned my skin, and I couldn't breathe. Then I think at that moment, I'm not dying squashed to death, but now I'm gonna die of asphyxia. So I have to put my face under my shirt to be able to breathe. And hours after, I was pulled from the rubble, thinking at that moment that I lost my legs. But a miracle. I didn't break a single bone.
Rodriguez weet op dat moment nog niet wat er is gebeurd. Wat die eerste veronderstelde explosie heeft veroorzaakt, vlak voor het eerste vliegtuig nog.
I don't know if it was a bomb or not. I am not an expert in explosives. It sounded like one. It made the noise like one. It created, a destruction level that, I wouldn't expect anything else to be but that. But was that a bomb? I have no idea what it was. Compassion is more powerful than violence. It will make you act in ways that you never saw possible. And I was so desperate to get to my friends and to save them. And the sad thing is that I was recognized for saving hundreds of people, but the people that I really wanted to help, I never was able to save a single one of them. I lost 200 friends on 9/11. A lot of people call me a conspiracy theorist. And it's funny because I was there. I am an eyewitness. I experienced the event. I do not speculate because I experienced it in my own skin. I have the people that have come out and validated the story constantly. I have the people that have survived also the event and have tried to tell their part of the story, which actually coincide with mine. I lost 200 friends that do not have answers, and I will continue until we get the answers.
I studied physics at MIT. I did electrical engineering for about 8 years. I've had quite a bit of practical engineering experience. When I first saw the collapses, I was absolutely convinced that they were not spontaneous. One of the first things that I did was to speak with one of my patients, who is a retired Army Corps of Engineers fellow who's done a lot of demolition and construction. Showed him some of the public source videos that are available of it, and he immediately pointed out that there were squibs, which represent little puffs of smoke essentially coming out of the buildings initially, which were clearly a sign of controlled demolition. He had no opinions beyond that, but he said without doubt that it was a controlled demolition. That sort of set me on the path of continuing to examine it and trying to gather as much evidence as I could. And the question I pose, what don't we know and why don't we know it, is sort of addressing the fact that at this point we still do not really have a meaningful explanation for what happened to the buildings. We have had several studies at this point, which I will go into, as to trying to determine a plausible scenario for the collapse. As of this point, none of them have presented us with anything that I think could be reasonably called a convincing and detailed account of why the collapse has occurred. And the question that's been addressed previously, the enormous destruction of physical evidence, as Chris was saying, the site was scrubbed very thoroughly. Out of the entire mass of the buildings that were destroyed, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, who are now doing the ongoing investigation, managed to save about 240 pieces out of the entire building. All of the rest of it was basically recycled. The obvious question is what does it mean that there was a controlled demolition? At the simplest level, it means that someone had a lot of access to the buildings over a long enough period of time to set this up. It implies, as many other things have tonight, that the people who had effective control of the site had an interest in having it scrubbed and making sure that no information was available, that a forensic reconstruction couldn't be done. Even in much smaller catastrophes, we typically will reconstruct things as completely as possible. For example, TWA Flight 800 pieces were dredged off the bottom of the sea. A complete reconstruction was done to allow a detailed analysis. In this case, the exact opposite was done. The first report that was really issued on this was issued by FEMA in collaboration with the American Society of Civil Engineers. There was basically a volunteer team from ASCE that had very limited access to the site. A lot of the pieces that they were able to retrieve were retrieved by going to landfills and trying to find interesting pieces before they were disposed of. The initial FEMA report basically acknowledged that the kerosene would have burned off very quickly. What wasn't destroyed in the initial fireball would have been consumed fairly rapidly and would have only really served as an ignition for the rest of the material. And the second point being that the fuel here really was strictly office contents. If you think of a modern office with copying machines, computers, and as has been previously mentioned, the smoke, particularly from Building 2, just before it collapsed, was very black looking. This is generally an indication of an inefficient fire in which there's not enough oxygen for the amount of fuel. These types of fires typically burn very cool. They are not hot flames like blowtorches. The cores themselves, basically, if you've seen diagrams of the building, there's a large central rectangle in each of the towers that contained 47 columns. And these columns basically were the primary structural support of the building. They were given the role of supporting the whole gravitational load of the building. Since they were so strong, it would have been reasonable to think that they would have withstood, at least to some extent, the collapse. But in fact, as we see after the buildings collapsed, there was basically only little stubs of these things standing up a floor or two above the ground level. The cores did not have much in them that would burn. The cores basically were dedicated to things like elevator shafts, utility shafts, stairways. So you have drywall material, you have a little bit of carpeting, you don't really have any inflammable material in the core itself. The core was specifically designed so it could not function as a chimney. They did not want, in the case of a fire, for the fire to be able to travel through the elevators or for air to come in through the elevators. So they were designed with what this architect Aaron Swirsky, I believe it was, referred to as a hermetically sealed system. There were fire shutters that were designed to close off the core in the event of an event like this. And those, as far as we know, functioned properly, which means that there was a very limited amount of oxygen available. Okay, as far as the issue of what failed and how, some of the initial suggestions, and these showed up in the NOVA documentary, which is a good example of what I like to call proof by computer animation. Thomas Egar, who was a material scientist but not a structural engineer, who became a spokesman for these documentaries, indicated that the floors had somehow failed, that the trusses supporting the floors had failed. This was the theory that was put forward actually in the initial FEMA report. Subsequently, there have been basically complete contradictions of that. Jim Hoffman has done quite a bit of research which is available on the web concerning the problems with this idea that the floors would have simply fallen. There was a study done by Weidlinger Associates. The chief engineer there was Mathis Levy, who's a very well-known authority on building collapses. He specifically disavowed the idea of pancaking or collapsing of the floors. And the most recent official report we have on this, which is from National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST, rejected the idea that floor collapse was part of it. And so as a result, we have basically no sequential model at this point. What NIST has suggested is that there was some kind of simultaneous collapse of the cores, but they have not attempted to give any kind of modeling as to whether those cores could have in fact been destroyed by the fires in the way that they claim.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
I walked into the office and the first words that I heard was, a plane's just run into the World Trade Center. And my initial thought was, well, that's okay. It's built to withstand a 707.
It did not seem possible that these towers that were designed to withstand the impact of a 707 could possibly collapse in such a short order of time from the time that they were hit. They were designed to withstand hurricane force winds of up to 140 miles an hour.
These buildings are built to handle several times the load above them. Those perimeter columns could handle 5 times the load above them, and the core columns could handle 3 times the load above them.
I remember walking up to a window, and a young man turned to me with tears coming down his face, and he said, "Will they fall down?" And I said, "No." Never has a steel structure building in the history of steel structured buildings ever fallen down for the reasons of fire.
The majority of the jet fuel was burnt up instantly in the big fireball, and it was gone. The fires that were left were office furnishings and carpet and things like that. A lot of things in these kind of buildings have to be fire resistant by nature. It's required by code. So there really isn't a whole lot of fuel in there to begin with.
The media portrayed these fires as being extremely hot, but the fires were not that hot in World Trade Center 1 and 2. If you look at the NIST zone data, you could see this. And to use our own powers of observation, you could tell by seeing these fires and seeing black smoke come out the windows. That means that the fires were oxygen starved, and it was incomplete combustion, and so it was a low temperature fire.
I looked up in a manual the burning temperature of jet fuel and found that under the conditions that existed at the World Trade Center on 9/11, that jet fuel had to have been burning at about 750 degrees Fahrenheit. I also noticed that the official explanation of what happened there was that the heat from the fire supposedly softened the steel and thereby brought the buildings down. If you have a flame at 750 degrees, you can hold that flame under a steel beam forever, and you'll never reach a high enough temperature to bend steel, let alone melt it. So immediately I knew at that point that the official explanation was dead wrong.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was lava from a
volcano. Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
This fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat into one single element.
And they pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
eyewitnesses, firemen, and lots of people described the flowing molten metal, iron or steel, at extremely hot temperatures. And John Gross categorically denied their observations, so that because their observations don't fit his preconceived notion, he not only ignored evidence, he denied evidence.
There were reports of molten steel having been seen in the rubble pile of all three buildings, and I knew that jet fuel, which is essentially kerosene, is not capable of melting steel nor iron. Kerosene or jet fuel burns at less than 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, and molten steel needs at least 2700 degrees Fahrenheit in order to melt.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel. And yet we have evidence of molten iron in the microspheres, in the rubble pile, and the metal pouring out of the side of the tower.
I worked as in the project engineering department of the casting plant of Alcan, the aluminum company of Canada, one of the largest aluminum smelters on the planet at the time. And in that smelter we turned aluminum oxide into aluminum, molten aluminum. Molten aluminum is silver. It's not yellow, it's silver. It looks like mercury. The yellow molten metal that I saw pouring out of the South Tower is indicative of molten iron.
Overflights had detected with infrared camera 1400 degree Fahrenheit hotspots on the surface of ground zero. And that being there for a week, indicates that there was something very hot going on below the surface.
This is how it's been since day one. Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a core at some point, and it looked like an oven. It was just roaring inside. And it's just a bright reddish orange color. See that stuff he's pulling out? What was that, Chief? We're gonna hold off on the water. See the stuff he's pulling out? Yeah. It's red hot. If we hit it too much steam, you won't be able to see what he's doing. Great.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's from the fires that are still burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. Every now and then, one of the pieces of equipment will dig in, they'll open up a small area, the oxygen will rush in, and you'll get this plume of brown, black smoke coming up. That's because that fire just got more oxygen. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
One of the most significant things to my thinking that indicates that this could not have been the sort of collapse that we are told it was is the presence of the dust clouds. And as you've seen in the pictures, and I'm sure all of us have seen probably more than we would like, there were very, very large clouds of very thick dust that enveloped the area, that crossed the river, that made it almost all the way to New Jersey from the pictures that I've seen. This type of flow is something that we are familiar with in physics. It occurs in only two situations that we know of naturally. One is in volcanic eruptions where a large amount of material is suddenly exploded into the air and basically forms small particles. The other situation is something called turbidity currents. These occur along the edges of the continental shelves where mud or sediment will slump, become suspended in water. And the common thread is that you have large amounts of a dense material that is suspended very quickly in a fluid, thereby creating another denser fluid, which is in effect the dust cloud. And that fluid can achieve considerable velocities. The problem with creating this sort of slurry of fine particles is that there really is no mechanism that has been proposed. We have concrete floors with carpeting or flooring over them. We have furniture. We have floors basically that are coming together in a collapse, but the concrete is basically protected under these layers. Early in the collapse, in the very first moments, we see these thick clouds being ejected at very high speed. They're clearly dense because they flow downward and become part of this large overall pyroclastic flow. What we're basically being told is that the concrete sort of jumped up into midair, exploded itself, and then was ejected as the floors came together. Not a very plausible mechanism, but I have yet to hear of anything else proposed to explain it. From quite a few people on the scene, we've been told that the powder represented most of the concrete, that the amount of intact macroscopic chunks of concrete on the scene were negligible, that basically everything was reduced to powder. And incidentally, we also know that other things besides concrete were reduced to powder. We know that contents of computers, exotic metals from computer chips, these sorts of things were also identified in the dust and in very small particles, generally on the order of less than 100 microns in diameter. So we have a real issue of mechanism as far as what in the process of this collapse could cause so many things to be pulverized so finely.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
The spread of debris in a large radius around each tower. What we see is an outward explosion of material beyond the perimeters of each footprint. And this is not expected, and it's not congruent with the reports of our government.
Large multi-ton beams were hurled hundreds of yards laterally. Gravity works vertically, not laterally.
So something's happening to throw these things horizontally at those kinds of speeds. And here it is trailing white smoke the whole time. It really is indicative of some kind of explosion.
The individual explosions that I noticed 20 and 30 and 40 stories below the collapsing structure.
And naysayers tend to say, well, that's just air being blown out the windows. I mean, it doesn't really work to say it's just air pressure. And I've estimated these are coming out faster than 100 miles an hour.
The floors pancaking upon themselves would create gushes of air out the side, but not the kind of explosive force that we saw that would throw I-beams across the street into the windows of other buildings.
The ejection of the materials out of the building, the manner in which it fell, the speed at which it fell, exhibited all the signs of demolitions and the completeness of the destruction down to their individual elements.
When the South Tower was destroyed, at first it looked like it was going to land in the street or take a building out next to it, and then all of a sudden it disappears in this huge cloud of smoke.
When you look at where the towers used to stand, there is surprisingly so little rubble. Where did all the rubble go?
It's a very good question, Peter, and I have asked some people who've been doing some of the rescue and recovery work this morning. If you look behind me, you can see the very remains, the skeletal remains of the World Trade Center. And one volunteer, Robert Gerlinski, explained to me the reason there's so little rubble is that all of it simply fell down into the ground and was pulverized, evaporated.
as an architect, I would expect to see larger portions of the building floors, the decking, the steel decking, the concrete topping, much larger remnants of what the structural components of this building was. After all, there was 110 floors in each building, and each floor plate was over an acre in size.
And there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel.
What happened to the concrete?
The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of Lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powdered 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
Just a couple of other anomalies. As we know, there were reports of explosions. There were reports of underground explosions in both of the towers at the time of the impact from a building engineer by the name of Philip Morelli. There are interviews with him on the web. From the Naudet brothers film, 9/11, we see that the lobby of the North Tower was extensively damaged with what looks like high explosive blast damage, and this was immediately after the plane collision.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building, but then another plane hit the other building. But when I was coming through the doors on the other side of the Trade Center, either they blew the lobby up or something, because it blew the glass out of the doors and knocked us all down, and I got smoke and everything on me. I just feel a little shook up because I got blasted, So.
The ladies that are with me were in the World Trade Center in the first building and escaped through the lobby, where they report they believe there was a bomb in the lobby.
We ran down the steps to the lobby. There was no lobby. Everything was torn up. And even the turnstile was burnt and was sticking up, and they just told us to run.
As we were coming out, we passed the lobby. There was no lobby. So I believe the bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds then the first plane hit.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were two explosions.
Okay. Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point.
They were having coffee in the World Trade Center when the first plane struck.
And all of a sudden it sounded like, I don't know where the subway is, but it sounded like a subway collision, a bomb, and it was just pounding, boom, 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 and I literally thought the subway had exploded and all the cars were physically land on top of us. It was so loud.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
Inside the lobby.
We stuck on the stairs for a while. We finally got down to the lobby. Then we get to the lobby, it was this big explosion.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
People not quite understanding what was going on. Then somebody said that they saw an airliner go into one of those towers. Then, I don't know, an hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that.
Then it was those secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
It sounded like gunfire, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated. If they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
And it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go like firecrackers.
They're reporting exactly what I would expect. You're hearing boom, 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 waves of explosions going off. Not one massive big boom.
There's so many videos of witnesses from that day that report explosions. There's radio transmissions from the FDNY. We have the transcripts that were recorded, back in 2001 of all these firefighters and first responders reporting explosions.
This testimony should have caused the presumption that there was a good chance explosive residue would be found and justified testing for it, rather than the opposite.
It doesn't look like a collapse. It's like a huge mushrooming, billowing kind of an event. That whole thing looks nothing like a building falling down. It's a building being blown up. That's what the physics shows.
Yet they refuse to consider the possibility that explosives or some other form of demolition device could have been used to cause the collapses of the towers. And the fact that controlled demolition is consistent with all the available technical evidence. And the response to that request for correction is NIST simply saying they're unable to provide a full explanation for the total collapse, even though that was their task given to them by Congress.
Even though a controlled demolition seems the only valid explanation for the collapses, the debunkers have brought different arguments against this possibility. The first argument is that it would have been impossible to place the explosives under everyone's eyes.
You would take an army of workers. It would take months. So this idea that, some crew dressed in black could sneak in the middle of the night and wire a building like that to be demolished is just, it's absurd.
Ipotizziamo che siano veramente state minate. Come si fa? Entrano di nascosto delle persone, portano dell'esplosivo. Scusi, sa, devo lasciare qui questa serie di zainetti. Non ci faccia caso, poi spariscono.
There are, however, different facts to be considered. The first one is that in the months previous to 9/11, a major renovation of the elevator system in both towers was undertaken. From the March 2001 issue of Elevator World, we read, Ace Elevator undertook what was perhaps one of the largest, most sophisticated elevator modernization programs in the industry's history at New York City's prestigious World Trade Center. No one is suggesting that this company had anything to do with the possible planting of explosives. But such an extensive renovation process would have certainly provided the cover for a special team to access the internal structure of the buildings at any given time. As explained by Richard Heumann, Chief Electrical Engineer for the Twin Towers, the elevator shafts gave direct access to the core columns.
I'm very familiar with the interior structure that surrounded the elevator shafts. And, of course, their access to the elevator shafts gave them total access to the surrounding core columns, the interior of the core columns.
Secondly, the movement of heavy equipment on floors that were supposedly empty was noticed in the weeks leading up to 9/11. Scott Forbes worked for a financial institution on the 97th floor of the South Tower.
It must have been at least 4 to 6 weeks before 9/11. It was like rebuilding work going on upstairs. The tenants, the people from Aon who had been there were moved somewhere else. The offices were just vacant. And there was a lot of heavy machinery building work going on. It was almost like pneumatic drills and lots of hammering, so much so that the floors were shaking. That's how noticeable it was. It was almost as if something heavy was being moved and then it was being taken off wheels, and it was like boom. Our floor underneath literally shook. You could feel the weight above you.
William Rodriguez, an employee at the Twin Towers for more than 20 years, recalls a similar experience.
As I stood there on the 33rd floor, I heard very strange noises on the 34th floor. I heard very heavy equipment being moved around, and it sounded like dumpsters with metal wheels being moved around, and I got scared because I knew it was an empty floor. Nobody was supposed to be there. As a matter of fact, not even the elevators stopped there. You have to have a special access key to open the door on the 34th floor.
Thirdly, after the 1993 attack, bomb-sniffing dogs had been adopted in the security system of the Twin Towers. But on Thursday, September the 6th, bomb-sniffing dogs were abruptly removed, according to a security guard, with no apparent reason. And lastly, there was an unprecedented power down in the South Tower on the very weekend before 9/11. For the first time in 30 years, all the security systems in the building had become useless at the same time. People could come and go as they pleased, even in protected areas, without being seen nor recorded by surveillance cameras.
The previous weekend, there had been a power down. Because of the power down, there was a complete breakdown of security that weekend. We had guided tours coming into secured areas by mistake and nobody picking it up because there's no intrusion alarms or anything else.
Scott Forbes was also present during the power down.
There was a power down in the South Tower on the weekend of the 8th and 9th of September. And it wouldn't have just have affected camera security, it would have affected all the secure systems on doors for either key locks or security badges and so on. To undo them, they weren't working because they're all powered by electricity, so there was no power, there was no backup system, therefore they were all open.
What again was the excuse that the Port Authority gave you, Scott, for this 36-hour period of the power being down in the South Tower?
The explanation was that there was a recabling exercise to increase the bandwidth of networks that were available in the towers.
The debunkers are right. It would have been very difficult to bring in the explosives without being noticed. But with the proper cover story, it could have been done under everyone's eyes, in full daylight, without anybody even questioning what was going on.
And as far as the initial impacts, this recent NIST study made an interesting point about World Trade Centers. The film analysis showed that it oscillated for about 4 minutes after it was struck by the airplane, and the oscillation rate was identical to what would be expected for the intact tower. Trade Center towers and most modern buildings are heavily redundant in the sense that the load bearing can be shifted to other members if some of them fail, and we saw that happen in this case. Stresses do redistribute, but absent further weakening of the structural members, that distribution is limited. It happens, the structure restabilizes, and unless there's significant further damage, it doesn't progress to a total collapse. For the towers to collapse the way we saw them collapse basically implies that the columns simply collapsed into themselves. They telescoped straight down. Steel keeps a lot of its structural integrity, even when heated, until you begin to approach the melting point. You don't really see a catastrophic loss of strength, and this is what we're talking about. We're talking about basically vertical box columns collapsing into themselves, which implies a complete loss of mechanical strength.
The top section, pushing on the bottom section, it's going to meet equal forces as it goes. Both sections are going to be demolished at the same rate. So by the time you've crushed up 15 stories below it, the top 15 stories are also going to be crushed. And so there's nothing left now to crush the rest of the building.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with two towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics. And our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But even if we assume that the top section of the tower had enough potential energy to destroy the rest of the structure below, it could not have done so at the speed it did, which was near freefall speed. Assuming that the top section on the left contains enough potential energy to destroy the rest of the tower, and assuming we dropped both upper sections at the same time, which one would hit the ground first? It would be the
structural steel and its structural system without it being blown up.
The only way that a building can accelerate as it collapses is by having pre-engineered, precisely timed, and precisely placed explosives. In other words, controlled demolition.
Saw the big hubbub going on around Building 7. Walked around it. I saw a hole. I didn't see a hole bad enough to knock a building down, though. So, yeah, there was definitely fire in the building, but I didn't hear any, maybe this is movie crap. I didn't hear any creaking, or I didn't hear any
any indication that it was going to come down. And all of a sudden, the radios exploded, and everybody started screaming, "Get away, get away, get away from it!" And I was like a deer in the headlights, and I look up, and I think I remember pretty clearly the two guys that I knew were on the transit radio. I don't know if those tapes are out there, but I can try and look for them and show you exactly what I'm talking about. But it was that moment, you know, get away, and I looked up, and it was nothing I would ever imagine seeing in my life. You know, the thing started peeling in on itself, and I mean, there was an umbrella of crap 7 feet over my head that I just stared at. And somebody grabbed my shoulder, and I started running, and the shit's hitting the ground behind me. And the whole time you're hearing thum, 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 thum. So I think I know an explosion when I hear it, you know. I was real close to Building 7 when it fell down, and running away from that sucked. That's one of the things that I live with all the time, and I don't know, but that didn't sound like just a building falling down to me while I was running away from it. There's a lot of eyewitness testimony down there hearing explosions. I didn't see any reason for that building to fall down the way it did, and a lot of guys should be saying the same thing.
The Red Cross rep was like, he goes over and he says, well, you got to stay behind this line because they're thinking about bringing the building down. They didn't say what building, they just said bringing a building down.
All I can attest to is that by noon or 1 o'clock, they told us we had to move from that triage site up to Pace University, a little further away, because Building 7 was going to come down or being brought down.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department, and they did use the word, we're going to have to bring it down.
The amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In my previous career as a firefighter, normally you'd never be afraid to go into a Type 1 building because they're not combustible, and you would just charge at it and put the fire out. Never in my training were we ever taught that these type of buildings could just collapse in on themselves. There's definitely much more going on than just fire.
The World Trade Center 7 building reminds me of the Meridian Bank building in some ways in Philadelphia. The Meridian Bank building is a 38-story skyscraper that burned for 18 hours in 1991, suffered extensive damage from the fire, but did not collapse.
NIST tells us that this collapse mechanism, starting with thermal expansion, that worked its way upward and outward through the building, in a matter of seconds, there's not enough time for the building to collapse the way that NIST tells us it collapsed.
NIST claims the fires were very large, very hot, and long-lasting, when in reality, observation, which has been researched by many people, shows these fires did not last very long. They were not in the locations where NIST claims they were at given times.
I'm a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. For the 40-plus years that I've been practicing architecture, I have designed a variety of buildings from small houses to high-rise office buildings. Some of the high-rises that I've worked on are 1-shell and 2-shell here in Houston. I was project manager for a 22-story office building in Akron, Ohio. Later in the day, when World Trade Center 7 collapsed, They had already showed us pictures of a few fires in that building, and I mean, they weren't even raging. And how could that cause a building to collapse as if it were imploded? Couldn't happen.
New York City, 2001. No tall building had ever collapsed primarily due to fire. But that's...
You hear that? Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. The building is about to blow up. Moving back. All right, guys? Sorry. We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up.
So we're like, okay, you know, we'll take their word for it. You know, we'll stay behind the line. And he went over and he talked to one of the, through all the commotion, he goes over and he asked one of the Red Cross, or one of the firefighters, what was going on. I guess, I don't know if he got an answer or not. He came back over with his hand over the radio, and it sounded like a countdown. And at the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1, and he was just saying, just run for your life, just run for your life. And then it was like another 2, 3 seconds, you heard explosions. Like, boom! It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Just in the last few seconds, another building, building number 7, one of the buildings in support of the World Trade Center towers, has collapsed. This is no small building, as you can see, at 47 stories. It would stand out in most American cities.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and you know, we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was. Well, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and you know, it was horrifying. And then, you know, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground. You know, we were in shock, and then the
high-rise buildings simply do not collapse due to fire. There has never been until 9/11 an experience where a high-rise building that was steel frame completely collapsed. There have been fires burned longer in similar structures without any collapse.
In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large...
The only positive aspect of this building's demise is that it fell 7 hours after the 2 main towers. Everyone had been evacuated, and even though the 47-story building collapsed in on itself in under 10 seconds, no one was killed.
World Trade Center 7 was completed in 1987. It had approximately 1.8 million square feet, 47 stories, and was roughly 600 feet tall. Each of the floors was approximately 40,000 square feet, which is roughly the size of a football field and equal to the size of the floor plate on each of the towers.
The building was a good building. It was soundly designed. It would still be standing if not for 9/11. And it was state-of-the-art at the time. Absolutely.
I lost my husband.
My son.
My uncle.
My nephew. September 11th, 2001.
Most people don't know a third tower fell that day.
The government says fire brought it down.
The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fires.
I, along with 1,400 other architects and engineers,
have found the government's conclusion to be physically impossible.
Impossible.
We need the truth about what happened that day.
Go to rememberbuilding7.org.
Why it fell, why it matters, and what you can do.
Do you believe that the government had anything
to do with the attack of 9/11? Do you believe in a conspiracy in terms of the attack of 9/11?
No, but I do believe that it is the first time in history that fire has ever melted steel. I do believe that it defies physics for the World Trade Center Tower 7, Building 7, which collapsed in on itself. It is impossible for a building to fall the way it fell without explosives being involved. World Trade Center 7. World Trader 1 and 2 got hit by planes. 7, miraculously, the first time in history, steel was melted by fire. It is physically impossible.
And who do you think is responsible for that?
I have no idea. But to say that we don't know that it imploded and it was an implosion and a demolition is beyond ignorant. Look at the films, get a physics expert here from Yale, from Harvard, pick the school. It defies reason.
Let's get one. Let's get one, because that
I would do it.
Is the unthinkable.
It is the unthinkable. But imagine if somebody could convince you of that, could prove it to you, Elizabeth. Just 7.
Did you know that a third tower fell on 9/11? At approximately 5:20 p.m. on September 11, 2001, World Trade Center Building 7 collapsed in 6.5 seconds from normal office fires, according to the government's final report.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
Later, the government finally admitted that Building 7 collapsed at the rate of free fall after trying to deny it. So what's wrong with a building in free fall? What is free fall?
It's just like taking your car keys out and just dropping them. That's how fast the building came down, for over 100 feet.
This is high school physics. A building cannot do free fall with 40,000 tons of structure.
What's this other jet doing? What's this other jet doing? Holy fuck!
Oh my God! Oh my God! Jesus fucking Christ!
Don't touch it.
Oh my God!
I mean, when you look at it, the building has collapsed. That tower just came down.
This was clearly, the way the structure is collapsing, this was the result of something that was planned. It's not accidental that the first tower just happened to collapse and then the second tower just happened to collapse in exactly the same way. How they accomplished this, we don't know.
We made it outside, we made it about a block.
We made it at least 2 blocks, and we started running. Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah, detonated.
They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down. I was watching it and running. Just ran up West. And then you just sort of, this cloud of shit chasing you down. Just ran up West Street. I could not run it. I jumped behind a battalion car, I hit under the car, it was swinging the car.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty.
World Trade Center Building Number 7. On September 11, 2001, it was one of the casualties of the terrorist attacks on that horrific day. Building 7's sudden and shocking collapse has been overshadowed by the fate of the Twin Towers. But from an engineering standpoint, it is the greater mystery.
We were surprised that Tower 7 collapsed. We being the team that investigated what occurred on that day. There was some damage to Tower 7 caused by the debris that hit it from Tower 1, but the damage was certainly not similar in scope or magnitude to that caused by the aircraft hitting Towers 1 and